There is a four-phase pattern that has destroyed currencies and wiped out entire populations' life savings 3 times in the last century. And it's not random economic chaos, it's a sequence, a predictable cycle that governments follow step by step, phase by phase, always claiming it's temporary until the very moment their money becomes worthless. 1923, Germany. 2008, Zimbabwe. 2018, Venezuela. 3 different countries, 3 different decades, but the exact same four-phase destruction pattern. Phase 1. Money printing to pay government debts. Phase 2. Asset prices explode while regular people can't afford basics. Phase 3. Citizens rush to spend money the second they get it, because holding cash becomes financial suicide. Phase 4. Complete currency collapse and reset. Weimar Germany printed so much money that by November 1923, $1 was worth 4.2 trillion German marks. Zimbabwe printed until monthly inflation hit 79 billion%. Venezuela's currency became so worthless, people weighed it instead of counting it. And here's what should terrify you. The United States has already completed Phase 1 and Phase 2. We are entering Phase 3 right now. If you want to understand exactly where we are in this cycle and what Phase 3 looks like when it hits the world's reserve currency, subscribe, because this pattern has never failed to complete itself once it starts. Hyperinflation is not an accident. It is a policy sequence. This fundamental truth challenges every mainstream narrative about monetary collapse, revealing instead a deliberate pattern of government choices that unfold with mathematical precision across different nations and decades. The academic definition, established by economist Philip Kagan, provides the clinical threshold. A country enters hyperinflation once monthly, price increases exceed 50%, and the crisis only ends when monthly inflation falls below 50% and remains there for at least 12 consecutive months. This seemingly technical boundary marks the point where money transforms from a store of value into a wasting asset that citizens desperately attempt to escape. 3 modern cases demonstrate this pattern with devastating clarity. Weimar Germany crossed Kagan's threshold between 1921 and 1923. Zimbabwe entered hyperinflation in the 2000s, and Venezuela breached the 50% monthly barrier after 2016. Each nation followed an identical 4-phase destruction sequence that governments worldwide now recognize but refuse to acknowledge publicly. Phase 1 begins with money printing to service government debt, typically justified by war, crisis, or emergency stimulus programs that politicians swear are temporary measures. Phase 2 manifests as asset price inflation, creating an illusion of prosperity for those closest to the monetary spigot, while ordinary citizens watch their purchasing power erode. Phase 3 arrives when public faith in the currency collapses, triggering a velocity spike as people rush to convert money into goods the moment they receive it. Phase 4 concludes with complete currency death and reset, where governments abandon the old monetary unit and impose a new system that wipes out savers while protecting connected insiders. Germany after World War I serves as the laboratory case for understanding this sequence. The war itself was financed largely through borrowing rather than taxation, leaving the government with approximately 156 billion marks in debt by 1918. The reparations imposed by the Treaty of Versailles were deliberately denominated in gold or foreign currency, preventing Germany from paying with its own paper money and creating an impossible trap. As the government began printing money to service both domestic obligations and foreign reparations, the hyperinflationary spiral accelerated until November 1923, when one United States dollar exchanged for 4.2 trillion German paper marks. The mathematical precision of this collapse was not accidental, but inevitable given the policy choices made years earlier. Zimbabwe and Venezuela represent modern reruns of the same destructive pattern, proving that technological advancement and economic sophistication provide no protection against monetary collapse when governments choose inflation over fiscal responsibility. Zimbabwe's money printing accelerated during the 2000s to finance chronic deficits, patronage systems, and military interventions, culminating in November 2008, when monthly inflation reached approximately 79.6 billion%, with annual rates exceeding 89 sextillion%. Venezuela's hyperinflation began in 2016 when collapsing oil revenues and populist spending commitments forced the central bank to monetize massive budget deficits, producing official annual inflation rates of roughly 130,000% by 2018, with International Monetary Fund estimates reaching even higher levels. The United States has already executed what historians will recognize as phase one of this cycle, on an unprecedented scale. The COVID-era fiscal response totaled approximately $5.6 trillion, producing a 2020 federal deficit of $3.1 trillion and pushing total federal debt well above 100% of gross domestic product. The question facing Americans today is not whether massive money printing occurred, but rather which phase of the hyperinflationary cycle the nation currently occupies, and how much time remains before the pattern completes itself, with the same mathematical certainty witnessed in Germany, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. The transformation of government deficits into central bank created money represents the hidden mechanism through which states quietly choose inflation over honest default, a process that operates through financial plumbing, deliberately obscured from public understanding. When governments spend more than they collect in taxes, they must bridge the gap through borrowing, issuing bonds that represent promises to pay future interest and principal. Central banks then purchase these bonds either directly or through intermediary dealers, creating new reserves and bank deposits from thin air to complete the transaction. This seemingly technical process constitutes the inflation tax, a method by which the state reduces the real value of outstanding bonds and bank deposits, effectively transferring resources from savers to the currency issuer without the political cost of raising explicit taxes or cutting popular spending programs. Germany's descent into hyperinflation began with this precise mechanism during World War I, when the Reichsbank suspended gold convertibility in 1914 and financed the war through credit creation rather than taxation. The German government chose to fund military operations by expanding the money supply, believing that victory would allow them to impose reparations on defeated enemies to service the accumulated debt. After the war ended with German defeat, reparations imposed by the victorious Allies were deliberately denominated in gold or foreign currencies, creating an impossible situation where Germany could not simply print marks to satisfy foreign creditors. The government found itself trapped between domestic obligations that could be met with printed money and foreign reparations that required real resources, setting up the inflationary spiral that would destroy the German middle class within 5 years. Zimbabwe's entry into Phase 1 occurred during the late 1990s and early 2000s, when chronic budget deficits driven by military intervention in the Democratic Republic of Congo and bloated public sector wage bill and controversial land redistribution policies that crippled agricultural exports forced the government to rely increasingly on central bank financing. What began as modest deficit monetization to maintain political patronage systems quickly accelerated as economic fundamentals deteriorated, with inflation climbing from double digits in the early 2000s to triple digits by 2004, reaching approximately 133% that year, before exploding into the quadruple-digit rates that would characterize the middle years of the decade. Venezuela's Phase 1 unfolded in a remarkably similar pattern, with the government's heavy dependence on oil revenues, creating fiscal vulnerabilities when global energy prices declined and domestic production capacity deteriorated due to mismanagement and underinvestment. As budget gaps widened during the 2010s, the central bank increasingly monetized government deficits to maintain populist spending commitments, pushing inflation from double digits in the early 2010s into triple digits by the middle of the decade, before breaching the hyperinflation threshold in November 2016. Modern economic research reveals that during the German hyperinflation, companies with high nominal debt loads actually benefited from the monetary destruction, as inflation slashed their real debt burdens and reduced bankruptcy rates among heavily leveraged firms. This debt inflation channel demonstrates how monetary debasement systematically redistributes wealth from savers and wage earners to borrowers and asset owners, explaining why over-leveraged governments and large corporations quietly support inflationary policies while publicly expressing concern about price stability. The United States executed this same pattern with unprecedented scale following the 2008 financial crisis and again after the COVID pandemic, with the Federal Reserve expanding its balance sheet through multiple rounds of quantitative easing that grew Fed assets from approximately $4.2 trillion to $8.8 trillion by 2022. Simultaneously, the M2 money supply experienced record growth rates approaching 25 to 27% year over year during 2020 and 2021, representing a cumulative increase exceeding 40% in just 2 years, and demonstrating that Phase 1 money creation has already been completed on a scale that dwarfs previous historical examples. Newly created money does not distribute evenly across the economy, but instead follows predictable pathways that systematically advantage early receivers while penalizing those furthest from the monetary spigot, a phenomenon economists call the Cantillon effect, after the 18th century theorist who first described this asymmetric distribution pattern. When central banks create money through bond purchases or other mechanisms, the initial recipients typically include large banks, government contractors, major corporations, and financial institutions that can immediately deploy this liquidity to purchase real assets at yesterday's prices. By the time this new money circulates through the broader economy and begins pushing up consumer prices, these early recipients already own appreciating stocks, real estate, commodities, and other tangible assets that will rise in nominal value as the currency depreciates. Late receivers of new money, including retirees on fixed incomes, wage earners whose salaries adjust slowly, and small savers holding bank deposits, experience the price increases before their incomes catch up, effectively suffering a reduction in purchasing power that transfers real wealth to those positioned closest to the monetary printing press. Germany's hyperinflationary period paradoxically coincided with a remarkable economic boom between 1919 and 1922, when real gross domestic product per capita rose approximately 20%, even as currency instability increased. German exporters, industrialists, and companies carrying significant debt loads flourished during this period because their domestic production costs remained temporarily suppressed, while the falling mark made their goods highly competitive in international markets. Asset markets, including shares, real estate, and commodities, soared in nominal terms, creating an illusion of broad-based prosperity that masked the underlying monetary destruction occurring simultaneously. This apparent economic success convinced many observers that moderate inflation could stimulate growth and reduce unemployment, a dangerous misconception that would prove catastrophic as the hyperinflationary spiral accelerated beyond control. Zimbabwe experienced a similar asset market mirage during the middle 2000s, when the country's stock market and real estate prices exploded in local currency terms as citizens desperately sought to convert rapidly depreciating Zimbabwe dollars into anything with tangible value. Investors and speculators who understood the monetary dynamics could achieve enormous nominal returns by purchasing equities, property, or commodities ahead of the general price level, while ordinary citizens paid in fixed salaries or holding savings accounts watched their purchasing power evaporate as consumer goods became increasingly unaffordable, despite apparent economic growth measured in local currency terms. Venezuela's asset bifurcation created stark divisions between citizens with access to foreign currency or hard assets and those trapped in the domestic monetary system. As inflation accelerated through the 2010s, Venezuelans with connections to foreign banking, dollar access, or knowledge of alternative stores of value could protect themselves by purchasing real estate, importing goods for resale, or accumulating cryptocurrency and precious metals. Meanwhile, the majority of the population remained locked into rapidly devaluing bolivars, experiencing hyperinflation as a confiscatory wealth transfer that redistributed resources from ordinary wage earners to those sophisticated enough to escape the domestic currency system. The United States has experienced perhaps the longest and most dramatic asset boom in recorded financial history since the post-2009 bottom, with Standard & Poor's 500 index investments generating approximately 900% returns through 2025, or roughly 560% even after adjusting for consumer price inflation. Multiple rounds of quantitative easing correlate directly with major stock market advances and persistently low long-term interest rates that pushed institutional and individual investors into risk assets seeking yield. Housing prices, as measured by Case-Shiller indices, have reached successive record highs, with particularly strong growth during the early 2020s and renewed acceleration into 2024 and 2025, creating a bifurcated economy where asset owners celebrate unprecedented wealth accumulation, while non-asset owning Americans struggle with elevated costs for basic necessities, setting up the classic preconditions for the transition from Phase 2 asset inflation to Phase 3 monetary velocity acceleration. The velocity of money represents the critical variable that transforms moderate inflation into hyperinflationary collapse, measuring how frequently each unit of currency changes hands within a given time period and revealing why monetary destruction depends as much on spending behavior as on money supply expansion. The relationship between money stock, velocity prices, and economic output follows the quantity equation where money supply multiplied by velocity equals price level multiplied by real output. But the practical implications become clear when expressed in everyday terms. Once money exists in the system, if people suddenly attempt to spend it faster, prices can explode even without additional printing by central banks. This acceleration effect explains why hyperinflations appear to develop slowly for years before suddenly erupting into catastrophic currency collapse within months or weeks. As the transition from hoarding money to desperately spending money creates a self-reinforcing spiral that overwhelms any attempt at policy intervention. Germany's hyperinflationary climax demonstrated this velocity explosion with mathematical precision as the speed at which money changed hands rose to approximately 100 times its normal peacetime level by 1923. The real stock of money, relative to national income, collapsed to roughly 1/100th of its usual proportion, meaning that Germans were holding practically no cash balances and instead converting wages into goods within hours of receiving payment. Workers demanded to be paid twice daily, because waiting until evening meant losing significant purchasing power, and businesses found themselves repricing inventory multiple times per day as the currency's value deteriorated by the hour. This velocity surge occurred independently of new money creation, demonstrating that the existing stock of marks was sufficient to drive prices into the stratosphere once public confidence collapsed and spending behavior shifted from normal commerce to panic liquidation of monetary assets. Zimbabwe's velocity acceleration during the late 2000s created similar behavioral patterns, with monthly inflation reaching approximately 79.6 billion% in November 2008, implying that people were using cash only as a medium of exchange for immediate transactions rather than as any form of store of value. Prices doubled in less than a day during the peak period, forcing citizens to treat physical currency like a hot potato that had to be immediately converted into goods, services, or foreign exchange to avoid wealth destruction. Venezuelan hyperinflation produced comparable dynamics after 2016, with daily life revolving around the immediate conversion of bolivars into dollars, barter arrangements, or tangible goods, as holding domestic currency overnight became financially suicidal. The underlying mechanism driving these velocity explosions operates through changing expectations about future purchasing power, creating self-fulfilling prophecies that transform monetary policy into monetary catastrophe. Once populations expect persistent future price increases, demand for holding cash balances collapses, regardless of interest rates or other policy tools, meaning that even a fixed money stock produces explosive nominal spending as people compete to exit the depreciating currency. Governments typically respond to this dynamic with price controls, capital controls, and additional money printing to finance new deficits created by the inflation itself, locking in the destructive spiral and eliminating any remaining confidence in monetary stability. The United States currently exhibits the preconditions for such a velocity explosion, with M2 money supply sitting several $1 trillion above pre-pandemic levels, following the record growth rates exceeding 25% during 2020 and 2021, while velocity of M2 has fallen to historic lows as households and institutions hoard cash balances. The 2021 through 2022 inflation surge, which pushed consumer price index growth to approximately 9.1% year over year in June 2022, provided the first broad signal that American price stability could deteriorate rapidly when fiscal expansion, supply disruptions, and abundant money intersect. If confidence in the dollar's long-term purchasing power breaks decisively, velocity can rise sharply on top of the already swollen money stock, replicating the classic transition into Phase 3 that has destroyed every currency that attempted to resolve fiscal problems through monetary expansion. Every hyperinflation terminates through a political decision to abandon or restructure the failing currency, revealing that monetary collapse represents a controlled demolition rather than an accidental economic failure, with governments deliberately sacrificing savers to preserve state solvency and protect connected insiders who understand the reset timeline. The pattern across historical cases demonstrates that currency death serves as the designed resolution to unsustainable fiscal mathematics, allowing governments to escape debt obligations through monetary destruction while maintaining the illusion that external forces caused the crisis. This fourth phase occurs when the velocity spiral becomes politically unsustainable, and authorities must choose between complete economic breakdown or imposing a new monetary framework that formally recognizes the wealth transfer already accomplished through inflation. Germany's November 1923 currency reset exemplifies this deliberate restructuring process, implemented when the mark had become so worthless that one United States dollar traded for approximately 4.2 trillion paper marks, and daily commerce required wheelbarrows of cash for basic transactions. The government introduced the Rentenmark, backed by mortgage bonds secured against German land and industrial assets, with the conversion rate set at 1 Rentenmark, equaling 1 trillion old marks, effectively wiping out all existing monetary savings, while preserving the real value of tangible assets. Money printing ceased immediately, and fiscal discipline was imposed through emergency powers, demonstrating that hyperinflation could be stopped instantly through political will rather than gradual economic adjustment. Savers holding the old currency lost everything, while asset owners, borrowers with fixed-rate debt, and industrialists who had converted monetary wealth into real property emerged from the crisis with their economic positions intact or even strengthened. Zimbabwe's monetary reset followed a more chaotic path of serial currency experiments and eventual abandonment, with the government effectively surrendering monetary sovereignty after the 2008 hyperinflation peak and allowing dollarization to emerge as the practical solution to currency collapse. Subsequent attempts to reintroduce national currencies, including bond notes, various iterations of the Zimbabwe dollar, and the gold-linked ZiG, introduced in 2024, have demonstrated the persistent instability that follows hyperinflationary destruction, with each new monetary unit experiencing rapid depreciation as citizens retain institutional memory of previous currency failures. The ZiG itself has already suffered substantial value loss and elevated inflation rates, proving that trust, once destroyed through monetary manipulation, cannot be easily restored through technical currency design. Venezuela's ongoing reset process illustrates the modern version of currency abandonment, with multiple redenominations of the Bolívar, including the Bolívar Fuerte, Bolívar Soberano, and subsequent adjustments that mechanically removed zeros from the currency without addressing underlying fiscal and monetary imbalances. De facto dollarization has emerged from below as Venezuelan citizens spontaneously adopted United States dollars and other foreign currencies to conduct daily commerce, while the official Bolívar remains deeply mistrusted, with inflation projections continuing in triple digits well into the 2020s. This parallel currency system demonstrates how populations protect themselves from monetary destruction by abandoning domestic money even when governments resist formal currency replacement. The reset process systematically rewards specific groups while devastating others, revealing the wealth redistribution mechanism inherent in hyperinflationary cycles. Governments experience dramatic reductions in real debt burdens as fixed-rate obligations become worthless in purchasing power terms, while large borrowers and politically connected entities typically preserve or enhance their relative economic positions through advanced knowledge of policy changes and access to hard assets during the transition period. The primary victims include small savers holding bank deposits or government bonds, pensioners dependent on fixed incomes, and wage earners whose purchasing power gets destroyed faster than their nominal incomes can adjust. This pattern explains why hyperinflation represents a wealth transfer mechanism disguised as economic crisis, allowing states to resolve fiscal unsustainability through the systematic confiscation of monetary wealth, while maintaining the fiction that market forces, rather than government policy choices, caused the currency destruction. The United States has completed the first two phases of the hyperinflationary cycle on a scale that dwarfs all historical precedents, creating the mathematical conditions for currency collapse, while maintaining the illusion of monetary stability through temporary suppression of velocity rather than genuine price stability. Federal debt has surged beyond $38 trillion by late 2025, pushing the debt-to-gross domestic product ratio well above 100%, with projections indicating continued deterioration toward 130% or higher by the 2030s. Annual deficits persist near $1.8 trillion, even during periods of supposed economic expansion, while credit rating agencies, including Moody's, have begun downgrading United States sovereign debt, explicitly citing unsustainable fiscal trajectories and persistent structural imbalances that cannot be resolved through conventional policy adjustments. The monetary expansion accomplished during the COVID era represents the completion of Phase 1 money creation, with M2 money supply experiencing year-over-year growth rates approaching 25 to 27% during 2020 and 2021, producing a cumulative expansion exceeding 40% within just 24 months. Even after subsequent contractions and stabilization, M2 remains several trillion dollars above pre-pandemic levels, creating what monetary historians recognize as a loaded gun scenario where enormous quantities of money exist within the financial system, awaiting the behavioral trigger that will activate their inflationary potential. This money stock sits dormant only because velocity of M2 has collapsed to historic lows as institutions and households hoard cash balances. But this suppressed velocity represents the critical vulnerability that could transform controlled inflation into hyperinflationary spiral. The 2021 through 2022 inflation surge provided a dress rehearsal for broader monetary breakdown, with consumer price index growth peaking near 9.1% year over year in June 2022, and demonstrating how quickly price stability can deteriorate when fiscal expansion, supply disruptions, and abundant money intersect. The Federal Reserve's response required aggressive interest rate increases and quantitative tightening that temporarily cooled inflation but simultaneously increased debt servicing costs on an already unsustainable debt stock, creating the classic trap where monetary authorities must choose between inflation control and fiscal sustainability. This structural contradiction explains why the system feels rigged to ordinary Americans who observe asset owners and large borrowers benefiting from decades of cheap money policies, while savers and wage earners face diminished purchasing power and limited real returns on conservative investments. The evidence suggests that the United States has clearly completed Phase 1 money printing for debt and Phase 2 asset inflation, while exhibiting early indicators of the transition toward Phase 3 loss of monetary faith. Growing interest in alternative stores of value, including real estate, commodities, precious metals, and digital assets, reflects declining confidence in the permanent purchasing power of dollars, while institutional and individual behavior increasingly prioritizes real assets over monetary savings. The persistence of elevated inflation expectations, despite Federal Reserve policy tightening, indicates that the anchor of low inflation psychology has been damaged, creating the preconditions for the velocity acceleration that characterizes Phase 3 monetary breakdown. Unlike previous hyperinflationary episodes, the United States benefits from reserve currency status and deep financial markets that provide temporary insulation from currency collapse, but the underlying fiscal mathematics and monetary dynamics are converging with the patterns observed in Germany, Zimbabwe, and Venezuela. The historical record demonstrates that governments facing unsustainable debt burdens systematically choose inflation over explicit default, using monetary expansion to reduce real debt burdens while imposing the costs on savers and fixed-income populations. The intuition among Americans that the monetary system extracts purchasing power from ordinary citizens to benefit connected insiders reflects accurate understanding of this wealth transfer mechanism. And the logic of the four-phase cycle suggests that with money creation already accomplished, the decisive variable becomes the timing of the shift in public behavior from holding dollars to spending them, at which point Phase 3 becomes visible in economic data, and the window for defensive positioning narrows dramatically.